Sign the papers and hand over your work drive. You're just a low-level clerk we can bully," my mother-in-law sneered. They celebrated winning a $72 million contract, not knowing I was the senior investigator targeting their company. Then mediation began. Welcome to Van's Rock Stories. Have you ever been judged because people thought your job wasn't important? Sometimes the biggest mistake isn't underestimating someone's paycheck, it's underestimating what they actually know. If you've ever dealt with people who looked down on you, let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe before we get into my story. My name is Naomi Carter. I'm 35 years old, and for most of my marriage, my husband's family believed I was nothing more than a boring government employee. I never corrected them. Whenever anyone asked what I did, I'd simply smile and say, "I work for the state." That answer was enough to satisfy everyone except my mother-in-law. Victoria Ashford loved reminding people that her family built things that mattered. They owned Ashford Construction, one of the largest contractors in our state, and every family gathering somehow turned into a celebration of another profitable project. Compared to them, I looked painfully ordinary. "So, still pushing paperwork?" Victoria would ask with a smirk. "Something like that," I'd answer. She'd laugh, and everyone else usually followed. The truth was, I couldn't explain my real job even if I wanted to. Confidentiality wasn't optional. I had signed agreements that prevented me from discussing ongoing investigations, even with my own husband. Ethan understood that much. Whenever I disappeared for work, he'd only ask, "Another audit?" I'd nod and say, "Yeah." He stopped asking for details a long time ago. Looking back, maybe that silence slowly built a wall between us. 3 weeks before everything changed, I left for another assignment in the capital. Victoria joked that I'd probably spend the entire trip buried under government paperwork. Gregory, Ethan's uncle and the company's CFO, laughed the hardest. I smiled, picked up my suitcase, and walked out without saying a word. In reality, I worked with a specialized investigative unit that handled fraud involving publicly funded infrastructure projects. Most days weren't exciting. They were filled with contracts, financial records, interviews, and long hours connecting details that didn't seem important until they suddenly did. By the end of those 3 weeks, I was exhausted. All I wanted was to go home, take a shower, and sleep. The drive back felt peaceful. Kids were playing outside, neighbors were walking their dogs. Everything looked exactly the way I'd left it. For the first time in days, I relaxed. I even wondered if Ethan had ordered dinner, knowing I'd be too tired to cook. Then I glanced at my phone. The last message I'd sent him. "Landing now. See you tonight." Still hadn't been answered. It wasn't like him. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was busy. A few minutes later, I pulled into our driveway. That's when I noticed all the cars. Victoria's SUV, Gregory's sedan, my husband's cousin's pickup, 2 more vehicles belonging to relatives who only showed up for major family events. I frowned. Nobody had mentioned a gathering. I grabbed my overnight bag and walked to the front door. The house was strangely quiet. The moment I stepped inside, every conversation stopped. Every face turned toward me. Victoria was already standing in the middle of the living room. The rest of the Ashford family sat behind her as if they'd been waiting for me to arrive. No one said, "Welcome home." No one asked how my trip had gone. The only sound in the room was the quiet click of the front door closing behind me. I shifted my overnight bag onto my shoulder and forced a small smile. Did I miss someone's birthday? Nobody answered. Victoria stood near the coffee table with her arms folded. Gregory was sitting on the couch beside 2 other relatives, looking unusually serious. Even Ethan's cousin, Mark, avoided eye contact. It didn't feel like a family gathering. It felt like everyone had rehearsed something before I arrived. "Naomi," Victoria said calmly. Put your bag down. We need to talk. Not, can we talk? Not how was your trip? Just, we need to talk. I set my bag by the door. Is everything okay? Victoria didn't respond. Instead, she glanced toward Ethan. He was sitting at the far end of the sofa, leaning forward with his hands locked together. He looked exhausted. Ethan? He finally looked up, for barely a second. Then his eyes dropped back to the floor. That wasn't like him. Even when we argued, he looked at me. He never avoided my eyes. What's going on? I asked. He opened his mouth as if he wanted to answer. Victoria answered instead. We'll explain. Her voice was controlled, almost polite. That worried me more than if she'd started yelling. Gregory stood and offered me the chair across from them. Why don't you sit down? I'd rather know why everyone is here first. It's important. So tell me. A few awkward seconds passed. No one moved. No one smiled. I slowly sat down anyway. The room stayed strangely quiet. I noticed half-empty coffee cups on the table, a legal notepad, several printed documents stacked neatly beside Victoria. This meeting hadn't started when I walked in. It had been waiting for me. Victoria folded her hands. You've been away a lot. I nodded. You know why? I know what you've told us. There was something deliberate about the way she emphasized told us. As far as this family knows, she continued, you disappear for weeks at a time doing compliance work. That's my job. Is it? The question caught me off guard. For a brief moment, Gregory looked toward Victoria as though reminding her not to push too hard. She ignored him. I've tried very hard to understand your lifestyle, Naomi. Lifestyle? I'd never heard her describe my job that way. I work, I replied. Same as everyone else. You call that working? Gregory gave a quiet laugh, but it died almost immediately when nobody joined him. The atmosphere stayed heavy. I looked at Ethan again. He still wouldn't meet my eyes. Honey, I said softly, can you tell me what's happening? His fingers tightened together. It's complicated. Victoria interrupted before he could continue. No. She took one slow step toward the coffee table. It's actually very simple. For the first time since I'd walked in, I felt something shift. This wasn't an emotional family intervention. It wasn't about my marriage. At least, not entirely. Everyone seemed to be waiting for Victoria to reach a specific point, almost like the next item on an agenda. If you've ever walked into a room and realized the conversation had already been decided before you arrived, you probably know exactly how that feels. Leave a comment if you've ever experienced something like that. Victoria picked up the stack of papers from the table. She looked directly at me. Then, without saying another word, she placed the folder in front of me. A divorce packet. My name was printed across the first page. I didn't reach for the folder right away. Instead, I looked at Ethan. Is this what you want? His lips parted, but no words came out. Victoria answered for him. My son has made his decision. I asked Ethan. Silence. He finally cleared his throat. I think it's for the best. Not I want this. Not I'm done. Just, I think it's for the best. The words sounded practiced. I lowered my eyes to the folder and opened it. The first few pages looked exactly like what I'd expect from a standard divorce filing. Division of property, financial disclosures, a proposed settlement. Nothing unusual. Victoria leaned back, watching me. We've been very fair. Gregory nodded. You'll see that everything has already been prepared. I kept reading. There were no outrageous demands, no argument over the house, no fight over retirement accounts, no request for alimony. Honestly, I was surprised. For a second, I wondered if I'd completely misread the situation. Then I turned another page. My eyes stopped. There it was. One paragraph, only a few lines long. The undersigned agrees to immediately surrender all government-issued electronic devices, encrypted storage media, authentication tokens, access credentials, and any work-related digital assets currently under her possession or control. I read it again. Then a third time. The room was completely quiet. Victoria broke the silence. That clause is just to avoid future misunderstandings. I didn't look up. What misunderstandings? You won't be working for us anymore. I frowned. I've never worked for you. Gregory leaned forward. It's simply cleaner this way. Cleaner. Interesting choice of words. I flipped back and read the paragraph once more. Government-issued devices, authentication tokens, digital assets. None of those belonged in a divorce agreement. Not even close. Most people wouldn't notice it. They'd assume it was legal language written by an attorney trying to cover every possibility. But I dealt with legal language every day. Every word in a contract had a purpose. Every sentence was there because someone wanted something. I slowly closed the folder. Who wrote this? Our attorneys, Victoria answered immediately. Which attorney? A brief pause. Gregory jumped in. Does that really matter? Yes. Victoria smiled politely. Naomi, you're making this more complicated than it needs to be. No, I said quietly. Someone already did that. For the first time since I'd walked in, Gregory shifted uncomfortably in his chair. It was subtle. Most people probably wouldn't have noticed. I did. I opened the folder again and let my finger rest on the paragraph. I've handled enough government paperwork to know this isn't standard language. Victoria folded her arms. You've handled compliance forms. I didn't bother correcting her. She still believed I spent my days checking routine administrative reports. That assumption had followed me for years. Now it was sitting right in front of me. What exactly are you expecting me to hand over? I asked. Anything related to your job? My laptop? If it's government property? My security token? If you have one. My encrypted work drive? Gregory answered a little too quickly. Yes. The word slipped out before anyone could stop him. Victoria turned toward him for the briefest moment. It wasn't anger. It was irritation. Like he'd spoken sooner than he was supposed to. I looked back down at the document. The language suddenly felt much less random. Whoever drafted this knew exactly what they were asking for. Not office supplies, not personal files. Specific government-issued tools. Specific access credentials. Specific digital storage. I wasn't looking at an ordinary divorce agreement anymore. I was looking at a request written by someone who expected me to possess things very few people even knew existed. I lifted my eyes from the page and read the clause one more time. This wasn't about ending a marriage. The paperwork was asking for something far too specific to be there by accident. I looked up from the papers and met Victoria's eyes. This clause isn't normal. She didn't even glance at the page. It doesn't have to be. Our attorneys included it to make sure everything is settled cleanly. Cleanly for who? For everyone. Her answer came too quickly. Gregory leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees. Naomi, you're focusing on one paragraph when the entire agreement is sitting right in front of you. Because one paragraph doesn't belong here. He gave me a patient smile, the kind people use when they think they're talking to someone who doesn't understand how the world works. You work for the government. They issue equipment. We just want to avoid any future disputes. I've never seen a divorce settlement mention authentication tokens. There's a first time for everything. I let the silence hang between us. Nobody laughed. Victoria crossed her legs and sighed. You've always made simple things complicated. I usually find that complicated things are being called simple. For the first time, Ethan rubbed his forehead and quietly said, Can we just get through this? I turned toward him. Are you asking me to sign something I haven't even finished reviewing? His shoulders dropped. I'm asking everyone to stop fighting. Gregory jumped in before Ethan could say anything else. If you sign today, we can all move on. Not if you agree to the divorce. Not if we settle everything. If you sign today. His choice of words caught my attention. I looked back at the document. You seem awfully interested in whether I sign this immediately. He shrugged. It saves everyone time. Or maybe it saves someone something else. His expression tightened for just a second. Small. Almost impossible to notice, but it was there. Victoria reached across the table and gently tapped the folder. You're exhausted. You've been traveling for weeks. Don't overthink this. That sentence bothered me more than I expected. She wanted me tired. She wanted me to stop reading. She wanted me to treat the paperwork like a routine inconvenience. Instead, I started reading even slower. Every page, every sentence, every footnote. The room became restless. Mark checked his watch. One of the relatives quietly whispered something to Gregory. Victoria finally broke the silence again. How much longer is this going to take? As long as it needs to. It shouldn't. Then whoever wrote this shouldn't have included unusual clauses. Gregory let out a slow breath. What exactly are you worried we'll do with your work drive? There it was. Not if I had one. Not what it was. What they would do with it. I didn't answer. Instead, I asked, why would you need it at all? We don't. Then remove the clause. Neither of them spoke. That was answer enough. I leaned back in my chair and watched them instead of the papers. Victoria looked annoyed. Ethan looked trapped. But Gregory wasn't paying attention to the divorce anymore. Every time the conversation drifted toward my government-issued laptop, encrypted drive, or security credentials, he leaned in. Every time we talked about the marriage itself, he barely reacted. That imbalance was impossible to ignore. I thought back over the past year. A few odd questions Gregory had casually asked at family dinners, whether I ever worked from home, whether government computers could access secure networks remotely, whether I carried encrypted files while traveling. At the time, I'd dismissed them as harmless curiosity. Now they didn't feel harmless at all. I lowered my eyes to the paragraph again. They weren't trying to negotiate the end of a marriage. They were trying to obtain something they believed I had. The only question left was why they wanted it badly enough to build an entire divorce agreement around it. And for the first time since walking through that front door, possible answers started forming in my mind. I kept my eyes on the document a few seconds longer, not because I was still reading it, but because I didn't want anyone to see the expression on my face. The wording wasn't just unusual, it was familiar. Not the legal language itself, but the things it listed. Government-issued devices, encrypted storage, authentication tokens. Whoever drafted this knew exactly what they were asking for. I slowly closed the folder and rested my hand on top of it. My pulse had picked up, but I kept my voice even. I need a minute. Victoria let out an impatient sigh. Naomi, there isn't anything complicated here. I disagree. Nobody spoke while I gathered my thoughts. Over the past 3 weeks, my team had spent countless hours reviewing contracts tied to publicly funded housing projects for military veterans. We weren't investigating a single mistake. We were looking for a pattern. Inflated invoices, missing inspection reports, safety certifications that didn't match the construction records. It had taken months before one company started appearing again and again, Ashford Construction. At first, I assumed it was a coincidence. They were a large contractor. Their name naturally appeared on a lot of public projects. Then more records surfaced. Different subcontractors, different counties, the same inconsistencies, the same approval chain. Enough to justify opening a deeper investigation. Even then, I never connected that company to my husband's family. Ashford Construction was a corporate name. The people I married into always called it the company. Victoria rarely used its full legal name. Neither did Gregory. That detail suddenly mattered. I looked around the room again. Victoria wasn't nervous. She looked impatient. Gregory was different. His attention never drifted far from the folder sitting in front of me. Not once had he asked how I was doing. Not once had he mentioned the divorce itself. Everything circled back to my work equipment, my access, my credentials. The pieces didn't fit perfectly yet, but they were getting close. Ethan finally broke the silence. "Naomi?" His voice was quieter than before. "I know this is a lot." I looked at him. "Did you read this before today?" He hesitated. "I skimmed it." "You skimmed a divorce agreement?" Victoria answered before he could. "Our attorney explained everything." "Did he explain that paragraph?" "He said it was standard." I almost smiled. It wasn't standard. Not even remotely. Gregory shifted in his chair again. "If there's something confusing, we can always clarify it." "Oh, I'd like that." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "What exactly would you like clarified?" I tapped the paragraph with one finger. "This list. It speaks for itself." "No." I looked directly at him. "It doesn't." Another uncomfortable silence settled over the room. The relatives who had been quietly watching us exchanged brief glances but stayed out of it. I wondered how much they actually knew. Maybe they thought this really was about a divorce. Maybe they had no idea why Gregory seemed so invested in one page of legal language, or maybe they knew exactly why they were there. I wasn't ready to assume either. One thing, however, was becoming harder to ignore. The requests in front of me only made sense if someone believed I had access to sensitive government systems. That wasn't public information. I had never told Victoria. I had never told Gregory. I hadn't even told Ethan the specifics of my work. So how had this clause ended up in front of me? I lifted my head and looked from Gregory to Victoria. Then I asked the only question that mattered. "Who told you I had access to any of that?" No one answered my question. Victoria glanced at Gregory. Gregory glanced at Ethan. Ethan stared at the floor. That silence told me more than any explanation could have. Finally, Victoria folded her hands and said, "You're asking the wrong question." "Then what's the right one?" "Whether you're willing to make this easy for everyone." I let out a slow breath. I asked where this clause came from. "And we're trying to move forward." It was becoming obvious they weren't going to answer. Gregory stood, walked to the dining table behind him, and picked up a thin leather envelope I'd barely noticed when I came in. He returned and placed it beside the divorce papers. "I think this will help." I looked at the envelope but didn't touch it. "What is it?" "A gesture of goodwill." "That's not an answer." "It's $25,000. The room stayed quiet. Gregory gave the envelope a small push toward me. "Take it." I looked at him. "For what?" "Sign the agreement today. Turn over the work-related items listed in the paperwork and everyone walks away." He said it so casually it almost sounded reasonable. Almost. Victoria nodded in agreement. "We're not trying to punish you, Naomi. This is actually generous." I looked from one face to another. No one seemed uncomfortable. No one looked surprised, as if offering me money had already been discussed before I arrived. I couldn't help asking, "You planned this together?" Victoria answered without hesitation. "We planned a solution." I almost laughed. A solution. That was certainly one way to describe a staged family meeting with divorce papers and a cash offer. Gregory leaned forward. $25,000 is more than enough to help you start over." "I have a job." "You won't need this one anymore." That caught my attention. "What makes you think I'm leaving my job?" He smiled. People change careers all the time. This isn't a career discussion. No, he replied. It's a practical one. His eyes drifted toward the paragraph about my government equipment again, not toward the financial settlement, not toward the divorce terms. Straight to that page. I noticed something else. The check hadn't been made out by Ethan. It wasn't even from a personal account. The company name was printed across the top. Ashford Construction. So this wasn't a husband trying to settle a divorce. The business itself was paying me. That made even less sense. I picked up the check and turned it over. Nothing written on the back. Just a clean company check. Gregory smiled as if he thought I'd changed my mind. You don't even have to decide right this second. I already have. His smile faded. I placed the check back on the table. I don't accept money to sign documents I haven't agreed with. Victoria's patience finally began to crack. This isn't bribery. No? It's a settlement. A settlement for what? So everyone can move on. I looked down at the agreement one more time. Then I reached for the pen lying beside it. Around the room, I noticed several people quietly relaxing. Gregory even leaned back in his chair. He really believed I'd decided to cooperate. If you've ever watched someone celebrate before the game was over, you know how quickly confidence can disappear. I uncapped the pen. Instead of signing where Gregory expected, I drew one long line straight through the paragraph demanding my government-issued devices, authentication tokens, and digital access. The black ink cut across the entire clause. The room went completely still. Gregory's smile disappeared. Victoria stared at the thick black line across the page, as if she couldn't believe what she'd just seen. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Removing a clause that has no legal business being in a divorce agreement. You can't just edit a document like that." "I absolutely can." I slid the folder a few inches toward her. "If your attorney wants to revise it properly, they know where to find me." Gregory leaned forward again, his voice losing the calm tone he'd been using all evening. "Naomi, that's not how this works." "Actually, it is." I flipped to the signature page. "The divorce terms?" I nodded. "I'm willing to sign them." Victoria blinked. "You are?" "I won't fight over the house." I looked at Ethan. "I won't drag this through court just because our marriage didn't survive." His shoulders lowered slightly, but he still didn't say a word. That hurt more than I expected. I wasn't asking him to defend me anymore. I just wanted him to speak for himself. He never did. I signed my name on the final page. Slowly. Carefully. When I finished, I capped the pen and placed it beside the folder. There. For a moment, no one moved. Victoria reached for the paperwork, quickly flipping through the pages until she found the crossed-out clause. Her expression hardened again. "This signature is meaningless without the complete agreement." "I disagree." Gregory picked up the check and held it toward me one last time. "You don't have to make this difficult." "I didn't." "You walked in here with nothing." "I walked in with my integrity." He let out a frustrated laugh. "Integrity doesn't pay bills." "No," I said calmly. "It helps me sleep at night." Victoria stood up so quickly that her chair scraped across the floor. "You're making a terrible mistake." "Am I?" "You'll regret refusing our offer." I picked up my overnight bag. I've regretted plenty of things. I looked at Ethan one more time. He finally raised his eyes. For just a second, it felt like he wanted to say something, anything, an apology, an explanation, a reason. Instead, he looked away again. That was my answer. I wasn't losing a husband in that moment. I'd already lost him long before I walked through the front door. The rest of the family watched silently as I headed toward the entrance. No one tried to stop me. No one handed back the check. No one apologized. I reached for the doorknob before Victoria spoke again. "You'll come back once you realize you have no leverage." I paused but didn't turn around immediately. Then I looked over my shoulder. For the first time all evening, I stopped speaking like the quiet government employee they thought they knew. You keep talking as if this is about leverage. Victoria folded her arms. It is. I gave a small shake of my head. No. My eyes settled on Gregory for a brief moment before returning to Victoria. You all seem convinced you're in control. Neither of them responded. I opened the front door. Before stepping outside, I said quietly, "If you knew what investigation is already in motion, none of you would be standing here this calmly." Then I walked out, leaving the house completely silent behind me. The front door closed behind me with a dull thud. For a few seconds, I just stood on the porch. The evening air felt colder than I remembered. I looked at my car sitting at the curb and finally let out the breath I'd been holding since I walked into that house. It wasn't the divorce that weighed on me the most. It was Ethan. Even at the very end, he'd chosen silence. I replayed the conversation in my head as I walked toward my car. Victoria's confidence, Gregory's obsession with my work equipment, the company check. None of it felt accidental anymore. I unlocked the driver's door and placed my overnight bag on the passenger seat. Before starting the engine, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my government phone. It had stayed on silent throughout the meeting. The screen lit up. 3 missed calls. 2 secure messages, all from the same person, Daniel Brooks. I leaned back for a moment before calling him. He answered before the first ring finished. "Naomi, you've been trying to reach me. You said you'd check in as soon as you were clear." "I am now." There was a brief pause. "You sound tired." "I've had a long evening." I figured. Daniel had worked with me long enough to recognize when I wanted to keep personal matters separate from work. He never pushed. "You still at the house?" he asked. "No." "Good." His voice became more businesslike. "We've completed the financial review. Anything new?" "A few things." I started the car but left it in park. "I'm listening." The analysts finished tracing the subcontractor payments. I grabbed a small notebook from the center console. "Go ahead." "We found another connection." "To Ashford?" "Yes." That answer didn't surprise me anymore. "What kind of connection?" "Multiple infrastructure projects." He stopped there. Not because he didn't know more, because we both understood secure conversations stayed on secure lines, and detailed discussions belonged inside controlled environments. "Can you make it to the field office tonight?" he asked. I checked the dashboard clock. It was later than I'd realized. "I can." "We've got the team waiting." Waiting. Not working overtime. Waiting. That meant everyone had already finished preparing. I looked through the windshield for a moment. An hour earlier, I'd been sitting in my in-laws' living room pretending to be nothing more than an overworked compliance employee. Now I was slipping back into the role I'd spent years protecting. Daniel spoke again. "I'll keep this brief. Okay? The draft authorization is complete." I knew exactly which authorization he meant, the one we'd been building toward for weeks. The one that couldn't move forward without my final review. I rested one hand on the steering wheel. "My family thinks tonight was about ending a marriage." Daniel didn't respond immediately. Then he quietly said, "And was it?" "In part. But not entirely." "No." I looked once in the rearview mirror. The Ashford house stood exactly where I'd left it. Warm lights. Perfect landscaping. A picture of success. From the outside, no one would guess how desperate they had sounded inside. Daniel's voice pulled me back. "The team is assembled." I adjusted my seat and shifted the car into drive. "They've been waiting on your call." I pulled away from the curb. Daniel's final words were calm, steady, and exactly what I needed to hear. "We're ready when you are." By the time I arrived at the field office, the lights were still on across the operations floor. Daniel was waiting near the secure entrance with 2 paper cups of coffee. He handed me one without asking. You look like you could use this. I won't argue with that. He studied my face for a second. Tough meeting? You could say that. He didn't ask for details. That was one of the reasons I liked working with Daniel. He understood that personal conversations happened when people were ready, not when curiosity demanded it. We stepped into the secure conference room. 3 financial analysts were already there, along with 2 federal investigators and a forensic accountant, surrounded by spreadsheets and transaction maps. The atmosphere was calm, focused. Nobody looked excited. Operations like this worked best when everyone stayed disciplined. Daniel tapped the monitor. Here's where we are. A network of company accounts filled the screen. Ashford Construction's operating accounts, subsidiaries, payroll accounts. Several vendors we'd been tracking for weeks. Our requests have all been approved, Daniel said. The financial institutions are standing by. I nodded. No changes to the sequence? None. That mattered. Freezing every account at once sounded dramatic, but it wasn't always smart. If everything disappeared simultaneously, people panicked. They started making desperate phone calls, deleting records, warning business partners. Sometimes they even fled. A staggered approach told us much more. You learned who they called first, which accounts they tried to protect, which transactions suddenly became urgent. Daniel pointed to several highlighted accounts. We start with secondary operating funds. Good. Payroll stays open for now. I agreed. This isn't about hurting employees. Exactly. The goal is to isolate decision makers. One of the analysts looked over from his laptop. We've built monitoring alerts for every outbound transfer. So, if they try moving money, we'll know immediately. Daniel slid a digital authorization tablet toward me. This is the final approval. I reviewed the document carefully. Everything matched our operational plan. Target accounts, legal authority, timing, reporting procedures. Nothing had changed. I signed electronically and handed it back. Daniel didn't press the confirmation button right away. He looked at me first. Ready? I thought about the conversation in the Ashford living room, the divorce papers, the company check. Gregory insisting on my work credentials. Victoria acting as though she'd already won. Then I looked back at the screen. Let's do it. Daniel pressed the authorization. No alarms sounded. No dramatic countdown appeared. Just a quiet confirmation message. Phase 1 activated. One by one, the first restrictions were transmitted. Not all of them. Just enough to begin tightening the circle. Within minutes, routine transfers from several secondary business accounts would begin failing. Most companies would assume it was a banking issue, an internal error, a temporary delay. That's exactly what we wanted. One of the analysts smiled slightly. First responses should start coming in within 20 to 30 minutes. Daniel nodded. And we'll see exactly who starts calling. I took another sip of coffee and watched the status indicators change from pending to restricted. Months of investigation had finally moved into action. Quietly, methodically, exactly as planned. None of us celebrated. Not yet. Across town, completely unaware that the first pieces of their financial network were already locking down, the Ashford family had gathered for a very different reason. They were throwing a party to celebrate winning their new $72 million government contract. I didn't go to the celebration. I didn't need to. Everything happening there was already being relayed to us through routine surveillance, financial monitoring, and public information. Nothing intrusive, just enough to understand how the company responded as the operation unfolded. Daniel looked over at one of the analysts. Any movement? The analyst nodded. They've started hosting the reception. A large monitor displayed a timeline rather than live video. Guest arrivals, scheduled speeches, expected financial activity. Everything we'd mapped out ahead of time. Ashford Construction had rented the ballroom of an upscale hotel to celebrate winning the $72 million infrastructure contract. The event wasn't just for family. Executives, project managers, investors, and local business partners had all been invited. Daniel glanced at me. Think they'll notice tonight? Not immediately. If everything works the way we expect. It will. The first phase wasn't designed to make headlines. It was designed to make people underestimate what was happening. One of the financial analysts suddenly spoke up. First blocked transaction. Everyone turned toward his screen. What account? Daniel asked. Regional operations. Amount? Not huge. He clicked through several windows. Routine vendor payment. Daniel nodded. Expected response? They'll probably assume it's a banking delay. I quietly agreed. Companies processed thousands of transactions every week. One failed payment rarely caused panic. One of the investigators folded his arms. If I were them, I'd call the bank. They will. And the bank? Daniel answered. They'll be told the transaction is under review. Technically true, legally accurate, completely ordinary from the bank's perspective. The analyst refreshed the screen. No second attempt yet. I leaned back in my chair. Gregory had spent years building the image of a meticulous financial executive. Someone like him wouldn't assume government action after a single failed payment. He'd look for the simplest explanation first. System maintenance, network delays, bank processing issues. Exactly what we expected. A few minutes later, another alert appeared. Second failed transaction. Different account, different amount, same result. Daniel looked at me. Still comfortable waiting? Absolutely. We're learning more by letting them react. He smiled slightly. Thought you'd say that. Across town, the celebration continued. Victoria was reportedly giving a toast about the company's future. Gregory was introducing the new government contract to investors, calling it the biggest milestone in the company's history. Champagne glasses were raised, people applauded, executives congratulated one another. For a little while, everything probably felt perfect. Then Gregory's phone vibrated. One missed transaction could be ignored. Two started asking questions. According to the activity log, he stepped away from the ballroom long enough to call someone in the finance department. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. When he returned, he was still smiling. Our analyst looked up from his monitor. He just approved another payment request. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Confident. Very. Seconds later, another notification appeared on our screen. Transaction failed. I imagined Gregory slipping his phone back into his pocket and forcing another smile before walking back to his guests. He wasn't worried. Not yet. If anything, he probably thought the bank's system was having a rough night. The first failed payment was easy to dismiss. The second was annoying. By the time the fourth transaction was rejected, nobody in our operations room expected Ashford Construction to keep calling it a coincidence. One of the analysts refreshed his dashboard. More activity. Daniel looked over. How many? 3 additional payment attempts in the last 15 minutes. Results? They all bounced back for review. I watched the timeline fill with new alerts. None of the blocked transactions were large enough to attract immediate attention from outside the company. That was intentional. We weren't trying to shut the lights off overnight. We were tightening the valve one turn at a time. Another investigator spoke from across the room. They're changing accounts now. I nodded. So they're troubleshooting. Exactly. Gregory was doing what any experienced chief financial officer would do. If one account wasn't working, try another. If that failed, test a third. From his perspective, he was diagnosing a banking problem. From ours, every move was telling us which accounts mattered most. Daniel walked over with a tablet. The banks are reporting increased inquiries. From Gregory. and 2 members of his finance department. What are they being told? The same thing. He smiled slightly. Your transaction is currently under review. Nothing more, nothing less. Legally accurate. Enough information to delay them without revealing anything. One of the analysts suddenly raised his hand. Hold on. Everyone looked toward him. We've got incoming vendor complaints. He enlarged another screen. Several companies had started contacting Ashford Construction asking why scheduled payments hadn't arrived. A concrete supplier, a transportation contractor, an engineering consultant. Routine business partners who expected deposits on time. Daniel glanced at me. That'll increase pressure. It already has. When vendors stop getting paid, they don't wait long before picking up the phone. Miss one payment, and people assume accounting made a mistake. Miss several, and confidence starts slipping. The analyst continued reading. One vendor has already threatened to suspend deliveries if payment isn't confirmed by tomorrow morning. Daniel folded his arms. They're running out of easy explanations. I thought back to Gregory. He'd built his reputation on being organized, reliable, always in control. The worst thing that could happen to someone like him wasn't losing money. It was losing credibility. Another notification appeared. Internal communication spike. Gregory had started contacting multiple department heads instead of just accounting. He was expanding the search. Our forensic accountant quietly said, "He's looking for something he can fix." "He's not there yet," I replied. "No. But he's getting close." Daniel's secure phone buzzed. He read the message and handed it to me. A field agent stationed near the hotel had reported visible changes in Gregory's behavior. He'd stepped away from the celebration several times. He'd stopped drinking. He was spending more time on his phone than talking to guests. Victoria, according to the report, was beginning to notice. I handed the phone back. "They're feeling it." Daniel nodded. "But they still don't know why." I looked again at the transaction logs. Then I remembered the divorce papers, the work drive, the authentication tokens, the access credentials. If Gregory believed the company was suddenly facing a serious financial problem, he might stop treating those clauses as a convenience. He might start seeing them as urgent. Another analyst looked up from his screen. "Gregory just left the ballroom again." Daniel asked, "Calling the bank?" The analyst shook his head. "No." He zoomed in on the communication log. "This call wasn't to the bank." I leaned forward. "Who was it?" The analyst looked at the number for a moment before answering. "We can't identify the contact yet." I had a feeling I already knew what Gregory was trying to solve. If he couldn't fix the problem from inside the company, he'd probably go back to the one thing he'd been chasing all evening: my access. The unidentified number didn't stay unidentified for long. About 40 minutes later, one of our cyber analysts walked into the operations room carrying a tablet. "I think we found Gregory's mystery contact." Daniel looked up. "Who is it?" "Not a bank. Not an attorney." He placed the tablet on the table. "Private cybersecurity consultant." I skimmed the report. The consultant had experience in network testing and digital recovery. On paper, everything looked legitimate. Then I noticed another detail. Several past clients had quietly been investigated for unauthorized access to corporate systems. Daniel caught my expression. "You see it too?" I nodded. "He's hired someone willing to blur the line." Our cyber analyst leaned against the conference table. "We've been watching their communications." "Anything useful?" "No direct admissions." He tapped another page. "But Gregory keeps repeating the same thing." "What?" "She has government access." I couldn't help shaking my head. He still believed my job was mostly administrative. In his mind, I probably had a secure laptop, a few encrypted files, and some government login credentials. Nothing more. He had no idea how closely certain systems were monitored, or how seriously unauthorized access was treated. Daniel folded his arms. So, what's his plan? The analyst answered. He wants the consultant to get into Naomi's accounts before she has time to change anything. I almost smiled. He assumes I use ordinary security. Looks that way. That assumption explained everything. Gregory wasn't thinking like someone facing an ongoing federal investigation. He was thinking like a corporate executive who believed every security system had a weakness if you paid the right person. Unfortunately for him, government investigative systems didn't work that way. Our cyber team had spent months building protective layers around active case materials, not because we expected perfect security, because we expected people to try. Daniel looked toward me. Do we intervene? I thought about it for a moment. No. The room became quiet. One of the analysts frowned. You want us to let them try? If they attempt unauthorized access, they'll make their own decisions. Daniel understood immediately. We observe. Exactly. No one encouraged the attempt. No one created an opportunity for it. Our job was simply to continue monitoring systems that were already protected and authorized for investigative use. If someone voluntarily chose to attack those systems, that decision belonged to them. About an hour later, another alert appeared. The cyber monitoring dashboard lit up with several failed authentication attempts. External source. Unknown device. Repeated credential testing. Our analyst straightened in his chair. They've started. Daniel looked at the screen. Any breach? Not yet. The attempts continued. Different methods, different timing. Someone was clearly testing for weaknesses. Then the activity suddenly changed. The authentication attempts stopped. A few seconds later, another notification appeared. The outside user had reached what appeared to be a valid login environment. The analyst quietly said, "They're inside." I looked at the screen without reacting. From Gregory's perspective, he'd probably be getting a phone call any minute saying the consultant had done exactly what he'd paid for. Whoever he'd hired almost certainly believed the same thing. They thought they'd found the front door. They had no idea whether it led where they expected. No one in the room celebrated when the alert appeared. Quite the opposite. Everyone became quieter. Our cyber analyst kept his eyes on the monitoring dashboard while another investigator opened an incident log. Daniel looked at me. The environment is active. Good. The analyst zoomed in on the connection details. They're moving slowly. Experienced? Daniel asked. Careful enough to think they're being careful. I watched the activity feed scroll across the screen, directories being opened, files being listed, permission checks, nothing destructive. Not yet. Whoever Gregory had hired clearly believed they were inside one of my work environments. In reality, they had entered a monitored decoy designed to look convincing enough to occupy an intruder while recording every move they made. The analyst continued narrating. They're mapping the directory structure. They're looking for case files. I'd expect that. Another investigator leaned forward. Can they reach anything real? No. The answer came from me before anyone else could speak. Everything important is completely separated. The room relaxed just enough to keep working. Daniel glanced at the live log. Connection is stable. Leave it that way. Every click created another timestamp. Every search request added another entry. Every attempt to move deeper into the system generated additional forensic records. No one needed to chase the intruder. They were documenting themselves. One of the newer analysts looked impressed. So every command gets logged? And verified, I answered. Device information. Recorded. Network routing? Recorded. Session history? Recorded too. He nodded slowly. I don't think they realize that. They don't. That was the entire point. People tend to behave differently when they believe no one is watching. The cyber dashboard continued updating. Search attempts, folder access, repeated scans for financial documents. Then the intruder started looking for archived investigative reports. Daniel noticed it immediately. They're getting more confident. They think they're succeeding. One of the investigators quietly laughed. They've probably already called Gregory. Probably. I could almost picture the conversation. We're in. Give us another hour. We'll find what you're looking for. Except there was nothing real to find, only convincing copies designed to occupy attention while collecting evidence. A notification appeared in the corner of the screen. External data collection attempt detected. The analyst looked at Daniel. They're trying to copy files. Any concern? No. The files weren't classified materials. They were harmless placeholders created specifically for situations like this. The transfer continued. Every second added another layer to the activity log. Daniel rested one hand on the back of a chair. Should we terminate the session? I shook my head. Not yet. One of the investigators looked surprised. The longer they stay, the more complete the record becomes. I finished. Exactly. No interruptions, no warnings, no sudden blocks unless absolutely necessary. If someone chose to continue an unauthorized session voluntarily, every additional action became part of the documented timeline. Daniel nodded once. Then he looked around the room. No one touches anything. The analysts stopped reaching for their keyboards. The room became almost perfectly still except for the monitors quietly updating themselves. Daniel kept watching the scrolling log. Let them keep talking. And let them keep clicking. Because every minute they believed they were getting away with it was another minute they were writing the record for us themselves. Gregory had no idea the most important part of his plan wasn't getting into the system. It was what he decided to do once he believed he was inside. The live session stayed active for almost another hour. Nobody in our operations room interrupted it. Nobody sent warnings. Nobody tried to scare the intruder away. We simply watched. The false files we had placed inside the monitored environment did exactly what they were designed to do. They suggested there were financial records connected to active government investigations. Nothing classified, just enough to convince someone they had found something valuable. They're downloading another folder, one analyst said. Daniel glanced at the screen. Still taking the bait. I folded my arms. They'll report success. Sure enough, only minutes later, the activity inside the session changed. The searching stopped. The system showed shorter bursts of activity, almost like someone was waiting for instructions. Our cyber specialist looked up. They're communicating with someone. Can we tell who? Daniel asked. Not directly, but the pauses are consistent with someone receiving directions. That made sense. Gregory wasn't a hacker. He was the one making decisions. The person behind the keyboard was only carrying them out. About 20 minutes later, another notification appeared. This one made everyone in the room pay closer attention. External financial activity detected. Daniel looked at me. That's quicker than I expected. It means they believe whatever they found confirms it's safe to move. The analyst opened another window connected to our financial investigation team. Several company accounts that had already been flagged suddenly became active. Not large withdrawals, not yet. Small transfers, test transactions. Money moved between subsidiaries, then into another corporate account, then toward an offshore company we had already identified weeks earlier. One investigator quietly smiled. There it is. Nobody celebrated. We had learned long ago that premature excitement usually led to mistakes. Instead, everyone kept documenting. Time, amount, destination, authorization trail. Each movement added another piece to the financial timeline we'd been building for months. Daniel leaned closer to one monitor. They're checking whether the transfer's clear. They're nervous, I said. They're testing the water before moving more. Within minutes, another transfer appeared. This one was significantly larger. Then another. The pattern became obvious. Gregory wasn't protecting company operations anymore. He was trying to move money before anyone could freeze it. Ironically, the very thing he believed would protect him was strengthening our case. Our financial analyst spoke without looking away from his screen. Every transfer is matching companies on our watch list. Perfect, Daniel replied. Another investigator turned toward me. So this wasn't really about stealing information. I shook my head. No. They wanted reassurance. They wanted to believe no one was watching before moving the money. The room became quiet again. The monitors continued updating almost every few seconds. Transaction confirmed. Transaction pending. Another authorization. Another destination account. Nobody touched a keyboard unless it was to preserve evidence. Nobody interfered. We wanted the timeline exactly as it happened. Eventually, Daniel leaned back in his chair. He stared at the growing list of transfers for several seconds before looking at me. A slow smile crossed his face. Then he said the words everyone in the room had been waiting to hear. Now we have them. The lawsuit arrived 3 days later, not by surprise, by courier. A thick envelope was delivered directly to my office while I was reviewing financial reports with Daniel. The return address belonged to one of the largest corporate law firms in the state. Daniel looked at the package. That doesn't look friendly? It isn't. I opened it carefully and started reading. The complaint was exactly what I expected. They accused me of stealing confidential company information, corporate espionage, misusing privileged access, interfering with business contracts, defamation, even conspiracy. The allegations stretched across dozens of pages. Some claims contradicted each other, but that clearly wasn't the point. The goal wasn't to win immediately. The goal was pressure. I flipped through another section. Their attorneys were demanding substantial financial damages, attorneys' fees, court costs, and additional penalties. The number attached to the claim was intentionally overwhelming. Anyone with an ordinary government salary would probably panic after seeing it. Daniel let out a quiet whistle. They're trying to bury you. Not legally, I replied. Financially. He nodded. They assume you'll settle. That was exactly what Victoria had always done. She believed every problem had a price. If intimidation didn't work, money usually did. If money failed, expensive lawyers finished the job. She still thought I was just a state employee who couldn't possibly survive a lawsuit against $1 billion construction company. One of our agency attorneys stepped into the conference room after receiving a copy. I've read enough. He placed the file on the table. This is aggressive, but not unexpected. He pointed towards several highlighted sections. They're requesting broad document production. They're asking for depositions. They're demanding access to years of your communications. Daniel frowned. They're throwing everything at her. The attorney nodded. That's the strategy. Keep increasing legal costs until the other side gives up. I leaned back in my chair. They're convinced I can't afford to fight. The attorney looked at me carefully. We can file motions immediately. We may even be able to challenge portions of the complaint before discovery begins. Daniel agreed. It could save everyone a lot of time. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. I kept turning pages. What caught my attention wasn't the accusations. It was what they had accidentally asked the court to allow. Their discovery request was incredibly broad. Financial records, internal communications, project documents, contract files, engineering reports, vendor correspondence, years of corporate records. Daniel noticed I had stopped reading. What is it? I slid the complaint across the table. They're asking the court to force both sides into full discovery. He read one paragraph, then another. A slow realization crossed his face. Oh. The agency attorney looked between us. You see something? I nodded. I do. Victoria thought she had found the perfect weapon. She had no idea she might have just opened the door to documents we'd been trying to reach for months. The attorney closed the file. I still recommend we try to shut this lawsuit down before it goes any further. Daniel looked at me, waiting for my answer. So did everyone else in the room. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The conference room was quiet except for the sound of pages being turned. Our agency attorney finally broke the silence. I still think we should move to dismiss this as quickly as possible. Another investigator agreed. They're using the civil case to pressure you. If we shut it down now, they lose that leverage. Daniel looked at me. What are you thinking? I closed the lawsuit and rested both hands on the table. I don't want it dismissed. 3 people answered at once. What? Naomi? Seriously? I nodded. Let them keep it. The attorney frowned. You're exposing yourself to months of litigation. I know. They'll demand documents. I know. They'll schedule depositions. I know. He looked genuinely confused. Then why would you want this? I stood and walked toward the whiteboard where someone had written a rough timeline of our investigation. For months, I said, we've been gathering evidence from witnesses, financial records, public filings, and agency reports. I picked up a marker. What have we struggled to get? Daniel answered almost immediately. Internal company records. Exactly. I circled the words. Internal emails, project communications, executive discussions, accounting records, the documents they never wanted anyone to see. The attorney slowly crossed his arms. You think discovery gets you there? I don't think. I know. Civil discovery worked differently from criminal investigations. Within legal limits, both sides could request documents, communications, and records relevant to the claims in the lawsuit. Victoria believed discovery would bury me. She hadn't stopped to consider it worked both ways. Daniel leaned back in his chair. They're opening their own filing cabinets. If the court allows it. They asked for broad discovery themselves. I smiled. They wrote the request. The attorney looked down at the complaint again. He reread several paragraphs more carefully than before. I was focused on protecting you. I appreciate that. But look at what they asked for. He turned another page. They're claiming you've harmed the company. Which means, I finished the sentence. They'll have to explain how the company actually operated. Now the room felt different. Not excited. Focused. One investigator walked toward the board. So every document they produce has to be consistent. Exactly. If accounting says one thing and internal emails say another, they create their own problems. Daniel looked at the growing list of possible discovery requests. We could legally ask for project safety reports, vendor communications, payment approvals, internal audit findings. He looked up at me. And correspondence tied to the veteran housing contracts. I nodded. Everything connected to the claims they made. The agency attorney finally smiled. I have to admit, I didn't see it at first. Victoria thinks she's dragging you into court. She's actually inviting you inside her company. That's the plan. Daniel laughed quietly. She spent millions hiring one of the best law firms in the state. And they may have handed us exactly what we've been trying to obtain. He looked at the complaint one last time before closing it. Then he shook his head with a grin. I get it now. He met my eyes across the table. This lawsuit isn't the obstacle. It's the opportunity. For the first time since the envelope had arrived, Daniel wasn't trying to convince me to stop the case. He finally understood why I intended to let it move forward. The mediation was scheduled for 2 weeks later. During those 2 weeks, Victoria's attorneys sent letter after letter. Settlement offers, warnings, requests for financial disclosures, subtle reminders that continuing the lawsuit would only make things more expensive for me. I read every one of them. Then I filed them away. Daniel stopped by my office the afternoon before mediation. "You've got everything?" I nodded toward a single leather folder sitting on my desk. "Everything I need." He looked around the room. No trial boxes? No binders? No stacks of evidence? I smiled. "Those stay where they belong." He knew exactly what I meant. The criminal investigation and the civil lawsuit were two separate matters. I wasn't about to walk into mediation trying to impress anyone with evidence I didn't need to reveal. Daniel leaned against the doorframe. "They're expecting a fight. They're expecting someone desperate." "I know." He hesitated. "Are you nervous?" "A little." That answer surprised him. "You?" "I've handled investigations for years," I said. "That doesn't mean family situations stop being complicated. Because this wasn't just another company. It was the family I had married into." Even after signing the divorce papers, part of me still remembered birthdays, holiday dinners, and ordinary conversations before everything had fallen apart. Daniel gave me a sympathetic look. "You don't have to prove anything tomorrow." "I know. I just have to listen." The next morning, I stood in front of my closet longer than I normally would. Not because I didn't know what to wear, because I knew exactly what impression I wanted to create. I chose a simple navy suit that looked professional, but unremarkable. No expensive jewelry, no government credentials around my neck, no lapel pin, no title on display. Just a plain notebook, one folder, and a regular handbag. Anyone looking at me would probably assume I was an ordinary government employee trying to survive an expensive lawsuit. That assumption was useful. Before I left, Daniel called one last time. "Our team will be nearby." "I know. If anything changes, let us know." "I will." He paused. "And Naomi, don't let them rush you." I smiled. "They've been underestimating me for years." "I don't see any reason to interrupt that." The mediation office occupied the top floor of a downtown office building. Corporate attorneys walked through the lobby carrying thick case files. People hurried between conference rooms while receptionists quietly directed visitors toward elevators. Everything felt calm, professional, ordinary. I signed my name at the front desk and took a seat while waiting to be called. A few minutes later, the elevator doors opened. Victoria walked out first. Gregory followed beside her. Behind them came 3 attorneys in tailored suits, each carrying multiple boxes of documents. They looked prepared to overwhelm me before the meeting even started. Victoria spotted me almost immediately. Her eyes moved from my simple folder to the empty chair beside me. Then she slowly looked around the waiting area. No legal team, no assistants, no investigators. No one appeared to be with me. A small smile spread across her face. She leaned toward Gregory and whispered something I couldn't hear. Whatever she said made him smile too. Victoria straightened her jacket, looked directly at me again, and seemed more confident than she'd been in weeks. She had noticed exactly what I wanted her to notice. As far as she could tell, I had come to mediation completely alone. A mediator greeted everyone with the same polite smile and led us into a large conference room. The seating arrangement almost made me laugh. I sat alone on one side of the table. Across from me were Victoria, Gregory, 3 corporate attorneys, and Ethan. It looked less like a mediation and more like a board meeting. The mediator reviewed the ground rules. 1 person speaks at a time. No interruptions. Our goal today is to determine whether this dispute can be resolved without trial. Everyone nodded. Victoria was the first to speak. "I'd like to begin by saying this situation is unfortunate." Her tone suggested the exact opposite. "We welcomed Naomi into our family. We gave her every opportunity to succeed." She folded her hands neatly. "Instead, she's chosen to attack our company with reckless accusations." I didn't respond. The mediator turned to me. "Ms. Carter, I'm here to listen." Victoria smiled. "That's probably for the best." One of her attorneys slid a folder toward me. If this matter settles today, both parties can move on with their lives. Gregory leaned back in his chair, looking unusually relaxed. You don't have to make this harder than it already is. You've got a government job. You'll recover. Our company has thousands of employees depending on us. The way he said it made it sound like I was responsible for all of their problems. I simply looked at him. He mistook my silence for hesitation. Victoria noticed it too. Naomi, she said in a softer voice, this isn't personal anymore. It became business. If you sign a settlement, everyone can finally move on. I almost smiled. The woman who had handed me divorce papers like they were meeting minutes was suddenly pretending to be compassionate. The mediator glanced at me again. Would you like to respond? I'd rather hear everything they have to say first. Gregory chuckled. That's smart. Because once our attorneys finish explaining the damages you're facing, you might realize this isn't a fight you can afford. One of the lawyers began reviewing the allegations: corporate losses, damaged reputation, interference with contracts, potential financial exposure. The presentation sounded polished, almost rehearsed. I took occasional notes but rarely looked up. Across the table, Ethan hadn't said a single word. At first, I assumed he was simply following his mother's lead. Then I noticed something different. He kept rubbing his wedding ring even though we'd already signed the divorce papers. Every time Gregory made another confident remark, Ethan's eyes shifted toward the table. When Victoria exaggerated part of the story, he quietly looked away. He wasn't correcting anyone, but he wasn't comfortable either. During a short pause, I reached for my glass of water. Ethan looked at me for just a second. There was something in his expression I hadn't seen in weeks. Not anger, not loyalty, uncertainty. It disappeared the moment Victoria spoke again. Our family has nothing to hide. Gregory laughed under his breath. Exactly. Then he leaned forward, resting both elbows on the conference table. His attorneys didn't notice. The mediator certainly didn't. But I saw the confidence on his face change into something else. Overconfidence. He looked directly at me and smiled. You know what's funny, Naomi? One of the attorneys quietly touched his sleeve as if signaling him to slow down. Gregory ignored the gesture. Then he kept talking. Gregory barely glanced at the attorney who had tried to stop him. He was enjoying himself too much. You know what's funny, Naomi? He said with a grin. You spent all that time protecting those government systems, and they weren't nearly as secure as you thought. One of the attorneys immediately turned toward him. Gregory. He ignored him. I mean, honestly, if someone wanted to get into your files, it wasn't exactly impossible. The room went quiet. The mediator looked up from his notes. I simply tilted my head. What files are you talking about? Gregory shrugged. You know, your work stuff. My work drive. Your accounts. He smiled as though he had just won an argument. I guess all those security trainings weren't worth much. One of his attorneys spoke more firmly. Mr. Ashford, I'd advise you not to speculate. I'm not speculating. He waved his hand dismissively. I'm just saying her system wasn't untouchable. I looked directly at him. So you're speaking from experience? For the first time, Gregory hesitated. Only for a second. Then his confidence returned. I'm saying people make too much of government cybersecurity. The mediator glanced between us. Mr. Ashford, are you stating that you or someone acting on your behalf accessed Ms. Carter's work-related systems? Gregory leaned back. It wasn't like that. His attorney quickly interrupted. My client is not admitting to any unauthorized conduct. But Gregory spoke over him. I never said I personally logged in. You don't have to do everything yourself these days. The attorney closed his eyes for a brief moment. That tiny reaction told me everything. He knew his client was talking far too much. I remained calm. So someone did? Gregory looked at me with a smug smile. I didn't say that either. You really like twisting words. I just like understanding them. The mediator quietly continued writing. Every statement, every clarification, every correction. Nothing was being lost. This wasn't a casual family argument anymore. It was an official mediation. Everything said in the session was part of the formal record. One of Gregory's attorneys leaned over and whispered something into his ear. Gregory finally stopped talking, probably because someone had reminded him that attorneys exist for a reason. The mediator looked around the room. Let's move to the next issue. Victoria straightened in her chair as if she'd been waiting for that invitation. She adjusted the papers in front of her and looked directly at the mediator. I'd like to clarify the company's position. Her lead attorney nodded. Go ahead. The mediator slid another document across the table. Before making any factual representations, I'll need you to affirm that your statements today are truthful to the best of your knowledge. Victoria didn't hesitate. Of course. She placed one hand on the document and calmly agreed to make her statements under oath. I picked up my pen again. Unlike Gregory, Victoria chose every word carefully, but careful people sometimes made even bigger mistakes because they believed they could control every sentence. The mediator looked at her. You may begin. Victoria took a slow breath, lifted her chin, and started giving her sworn statement. I reached into my bag without rushing. Victoria folded her arms. Gregory leaned back with a smug smile like he'd already won. Even Ethan looked exhausted, staring at the mediation table instead of at me. The mediator cleared his throat. Ms. Carter, is there anything you'd like to add before we continue? I do. My voice stayed calm. I've answered every question you've asked me today. I've listened to every accusation. Now I'd like everyone here to understand why I couldn't give you what you demanded. Victoria let out a quiet laugh. Because you didn't have access to it? I looked at her. No. I unzipped a thin leather folder and removed a sealed envelope. Gregory rolled his eyes. Another government form? This should be good. The mediator accepted the envelope from me. I'd appreciate it if you read the first page. He broke the seal, scanned the document, then slowed down. His expression changed almost immediately. He looked at me, then back at the page. He adjusted his glasses before reading the heading one more time. Victoria frowned. What is it? The mediator didn't answer right away. Instead, he asked me quietly, You are authorized to disclose this today? Yes. As of this morning. I slid another document across the table. This authorization came from my department. Gregory's confidence slipped for the first time. What department? I finally looked directly at him. The one you kept calling a low-level government office. Nobody spoke. The mediator finished reading and carefully placed both documents on the table. I believe everyone present should review these. Victoria reached for the papers first. Her confident smile disappeared after only a few lines. She blinked, then read them again. Gregory took the packet from her. What are you talking about? His voice sounded irritated at first, then quieter. He kept turning pages. I watched him recognize familiar company names, project numbers, contract references, case identifiers. His fingers stopped moving. He looked up. This can't be right. It is, I answered. For weeks, I had kept my position private because I was legally required to. Even Ethan never knew exactly what I did. I always described myself as a government employee because it was the only explanation I was allowed to give. They had filled in the blanks themselves. They assumed I filed paperwork, processed permits, worked behind a tiny desk somewhere no one cared about. I never corrected them. The mediator cleared his throat again. For the record, these documents identify Ms. Naomi Carter as the senior investigator assigned to a federal task force overseeing multiple public contracting investigations. Nobody moved. Gregory stared at me as though he'd never seen me before. Victoria slowly lowered the papers. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Even Ethan finally looked at me, not with anger, not with relief. Just complete disbelief. I calmly placed one final document beside the others. This is my official assignment order. It carried the government seal, my name, my title, the authorization number, and the effective dates covering the entire period they believed I had simply been away on routine work. The mediator examined it carefully before nodding once. I've confirmed the documentation. Silence settled over the room. Not the awkward silence from earlier. This one felt heavier, like everyone was suddenly replaying every conversation we'd had over the past few weeks. Every demand, every insult, every assumption. No one reached for the divorce papers anymore. No one mentioned my work drive. Gregory slowly sat back in his chair, still staring at the assignment order lying in front of him. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. Gregory kept looking between me and the assignment order as if one of us would suddenly admit this was some elaborate joke. Finally, he forced out a dry laugh. So what? You're an investigator? That doesn't prove we've done anything. His voice sounded steady, but he was gripping his pen so tightly his knuckles had turned white. I didn't argue. I never said it did. The mediator glanced at both of us. Gregory leaned forward again. Then why bring any of this up? Because today isn't about my job, I answered. It's about the decisions your family made after believing you could pressure me into giving up government credentials you were never entitled to. Victoria tried to recover. This mediation concerns a divorce, not some investigation. Correct, I nodded. And that's exactly why I found the requests for my encrypted drive, authentication token, and digital credentials so unusual. Neither of them interrupted. I opened another folder, this one much thinner. I'd like to clarify one misunderstanding. The mediator gestured for me to continue. The digital access you wanted wasn't valuable because of me personally. I paused. It was valuable because you believed it could open doors. Gregory's jaw tightened. We didn't know what any of it did. I met his eyes. Really? He looked away first. I continued calmly. My team has spent months mapping financial activity connected to multiple shell companies. I didn't mention every detail. I didn't need to. The interesting part wasn't the amount of money. The mediator looked up from his notes. It was the pattern. Victoria shifted uncomfortably. What pattern? The money rarely stayed in one place. I slid a printed chart across the table. Most of it had already been redacted. Only the flow remained visible. One account, then another, then another. Several transfers crossing different jurisdictions before disappearing into offshore entities. Gregory stared at the chart. His breathing became noticeably slower. You can't prove those belong to us. I don't have to discuss evidence here. I folded my hands together. But yes, we've been tracking those transfers for quite a while. The room grew quiet again. Victoria looked at Gregory. For the first time all afternoon, she wasn't waiting for him to answer. She was searching his face, almost asking a silent question. Gregory refused to meet her eyes. The mediator carefully organized the documents into separate stacks. I'll remind everyone this mediation is limited in scope. Of course, I replied. I'm only explaining why surrendering government security credentials was never an option. No one challenged that. The confidence that had filled the room earlier was gone. Even Ethan looked confused now. He frowned at Gregory. Dad. Gregory didn't respond. Ethan tried again. What offshore transfers is she talking about? Gregory immediately cut him off. This isn't the time. His answer came too quickly, too sharply. Ethan leaned back, clearly unsettled. I noticed Victoria watching her husband instead of me. That caught my attention. Until now, she'd acted like she knew exactly what was happening. Now, she looked like she had just realized there were parts of the story Gregory had never shared with her. The mediator closed his notebook. I suggest everyone take a short recess. Nobody moved. Gregory remained frozen in his chair, staring at the financial flowchart. Then he suddenly reached for his phone. His thumb moved quickly across the screen. No expression. No explanation. Just a hurried message. A second later, his phone buzzed. He read the reply. The color drained from his face. For the first time since I'd walked into that room, Gregory looked genuinely shaken. The courtroom felt very different from the mediation room. No one was trying to sound friendly anymore. Every word mattered. Every document mattered even more. I took my seat at the plaintiff's table while the Ashford legal team filled the opposite side. They had 3 attorneys, several assistants, and stacks of binders lined up in front of them. Victoria looked confident again. Gregory looked composed on the surface, but he kept checking his phone whenever he thought no one was watching. Ethan sat behind them, unusually quiet. The judge entered, and everyone stood. Once the preliminary matters were finished, the judge looked toward me. Ms. Carter, I understand you're appearing without retained counsel today. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor. You intend to represent yourself? I do. The judge studied me for a moment. You understand the responsibilities involved? I do. Across the room, one of Ashford Construction's attorneys exchanged a quick smile with another member of his team. I had noticed that smile before. People often assumed representing yourself meant you couldn't afford legal counsel. Sometimes they assumed it meant arrogance. Neither assumption bothered me. The judge nodded. Very well, we'll proceed. The company's lead attorney stood first. He spoke smoothly, carefully introducing the lawsuit as a simple dispute caused by malicious interference with the company's business reputation. Listening to him, anyone unfamiliar with the facts might have believed I had launched a personal campaign against my former in-laws. He never mentioned the divorce. He certainly never mentioned the requests for my government credentials. Every sentence was polished, every accusation carefully phrased. I wrote notes while he spoke, not because I was nervous, because details mattered. When he finished, the judge turned to me. Ms. Carter, would you like to make an opening statement now? I'd prefer to reserve it until after the initial exhibits. The judge nodded. Very well. The attorney smiled politely. As the court wishes. He motioned toward one of his assistants. A large binder was carried to the evidence table. I'd like to introduce Plaintiff's Exhibit 1. The clerk accepted it. What does the exhibit contain? The judge asked. Our client's primary financial records related to the damages claimed in this case. The attorney spoke with complete confidence. These documents demonstrate the severe financial harm suffered by Ashford Construction. Gregory finally looked relieved. This was familiar territory. Numbers, contracts, accounting. Things he believed his company controlled completely. The clerk distributed copies. One was handed to me. The binder was thicker than I expected. Several hundred pages, invoices, payment summaries, contract schedules, bank reconciliations. I quietly flipped through the first section. The attorney continued speaking. As the court will see, these records establish substantial economic losses directly attributable to the defendant's conduct. I didn't interrupt. I kept turning pages. A few figures immediately caught my attention. Not because they were shocking, because I recognized them. I'd seen some of those transaction references before, just in a very different context. The attorney continued explaining the damages model while I marked several pages with small adhesive tabs. He noticed. So you've already found something interesting, Ms. Carter? I looked up. I've found something. He smiled confidently. I'm sure you'll have an opportunity to ask questions during cross-examination. I will. The judge glanced toward me. Any objection to admitting Exhibit 1? I closed the binder. No objection, Your Honor. For the first time, the attorney hesitated. He had probably expected me to argue. Instead, I accepted the evidence without resistance. He frowned slightly before sitting back down. I rested one hand on the binder. The documents they had voluntarily submitted looked very familiar. Familiar enough that I already knew exactly which section I wanted to discuss first. I stood with the company's financial binder in my hands. Your Honor, I'd like permission to question the accuracy of Plaintiff's Exhibit 1. The judge nodded. You may proceed. I walked to the evidence screen and opened the binder to the first page I'd marked. This invoice is dated March 18th. The company's attorney answered immediately. Correct. It lists a subcontractor payment of $4.8 million. Correct. I turned another page, and according to your own summary, that payment cleared 2 business days later. Yes. I looked at the judge. Now I'd like everyone to compare that with page 84. The courtroom grew quiet as pages turned. The attorney's smile faded slightly. I waited until everyone found it. This ledger records the same transaction number. I pointed to the screen. But instead of showing the payment as completed, it shows the funds remaining available for transfer 3 days afterward. The judge leaned forward. The attorney quickly responded. That's likely a bookkeeping delay. Possibly, I said. Let's keep going. I flipped to another section. This vendor invoice references an account ending in 4427, then another. This transfer authorization references account 8153, then another. And this reconciliation lists an entirely different destination account. I wasn't raising my voice. I was simply reading their own records, one after another. The rhythm mattered more than the emotion. Each document raised another question. None of the answers fit together. The attorney interrupted. Your Honor, these are highly technical accounting records. The judge looked at him. They're your client's accounting records. Yes, but they require context. I agree, the judge replied. Which is why I'd like that context. A brief silence followed. I continued. I also noticed several payment approvals carrying identical digital authorization timestamps. I placed the pages side by side. The approvals appeared to have been signed from different locations within the same minute. The judge frowned. Can that happen? The attorney hesitated. It depends on the system. I nodded politely. I thought so too. I walked back to the table and picked up another page. This report lists an overseas consulting expense. I turned toward Gregory. You testified during mediation that you had no involvement with offshore financial activity. His jaw tightened. I did. So why does this report identify an executive approval code assigned to your office? His attorney immediately stood. Objection. The judge looked over. On what grounds? Argumentative. I remained silent. The judge considered the question. Overruled. The witness may answer. Gregory swallowed. I don't remember approving every transaction personally. You don't? No. I held up another page. Then perhaps someone else used your authorization. His attorney objected again. The judge wrote something in his notes before responding. The witness may answer if he knows. Gregory didn't. For the first time since the hearing began, Victoria looked genuinely worried. She leaned toward one of the attorneys and whispered something. The attorney quietly shook his head. Not now. Not here. The judge closed the binder for a moment. I've reviewed enough to conclude there are substantial inconsistencies within the plaintiff's own financial records. No one spoke. He continued. I expect a full explanation before this matter proceeds further. The confidence on the other side of the courtroom had almost completely disappeared. I returned to my seat. My phone, set to silent inside my briefcase, vibrated once. Only once. I glanced down during the brief pause while the attorneys reorganized their files. It was a secure message from Daniel. Just 6 words. Judicial authorization approved. Search teams moving now. My phone stayed silent after Daniel's message. It didn't need to say anything else. I slipped it back into my briefcase and looked toward the judge as the hearing resumed. Ashford Construction's lead attorney stood again, but his polished confidence from earlier was gone. He shuffled through his notes longer than necessary. Your Honor, we'd like to clarify several accounting issues raised by the defendant. The judge nodded. You may. Before he could continue, another phone vibrated across the courtroom. Gregory glanced at the screen. He ignored it. A few seconds later, it vibrated again. Then Victoria's phone lit up. She looked at the notification and the color slowly drained from her face. The attorney paused mid-sentence. Is there a problem with your client? No, Your Honor. But there clearly was. Gregory finally answered the call in a whisper. What? His expression changed almost instantly. What do you mean they're here? He stood up before remembering where he was. The judge looked over his glasses. Mr. Ashford. Gregory lowered his voice. I'm sorry, Your Honor. He stepped back, listening carefully. No one lets them into the executive archive without calling me first. Another pause. Then his shoulders stiffened. They have a warrant? He slowly ended the call. Victoria leaned toward him. What happened? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked across the courtroom. At me, then away. The company's attorney noticed the exchange. Gregory? He leaned closer. Gregory finally whispered. They're searching headquarters. The attorney froze. What? The investigators. His voice barely came out. They're taking everything. No one on my side reacted. There was nothing to react to. The investigation had followed the legal process from the beginning. Search warrants weren't surprises. They were the result of months of preparation. Another phone buzzed, then another. One of the junior attorneys quietly left the courtroom for permission to take the call. He returned less than a minute later. His face looked even worse. He leaned down and whispered something into the lead attorney's ear. I couldn't hear every word, only fragments. Servers. Forensic imaging. Records department. They've secured the finance floor. The attorney stopped writing. For the first time since this lawsuit began, he looked genuinely uncertain. The judge noticed. Counsel, is there information the court should be aware of? The attorney carefully chose his words. Your Honor, we've been informed that government agents are executing a lawful search at our client's corporate headquarters. The courtroom became unusually quiet. The judge simply nodded. I see. He didn't appear surprised, nor did he ask for details. This hearing concerns the civil matter before us. Unless the search directly affects today's proceedings, we will continue. The attorney swallowed. Understood. Across the room, Ethan looked back and forth between his parents. Mom. Victoria wasn't listening. She kept staring at her phone. More messages kept arriving, one after another. Gregory rubbed both hands across his face. They've taken the servers, he muttered. No, Victoria whispered. They couldn't. He shook his head. They're taking the archives too. Even from where I sat, I could see panic spreading through the company's legal team. They stopped discussing strategy. Now they were comparing messages, checking calendars, making hurried notes, trying to understand what had already been seized. The lead attorney finally stood. Your Honor. His voice lacked its earlier confidence. I'd like a brief recess to confer with my clients. The judge granted 10 minutes. Everyone stood. Before anyone could leave the courtroom, 2 attorneys from Ashford's own legal team quietly approached Gregory. They spoke so softly I couldn't hear them. Gregory's eyes widened. He immediately shook his head. One of the attorneys removed a folder from his briefcase and placed it in front of him anyway. "I can't advise you to continue under these circumstances," he said quietly. Then he slid a formal document across the table. It wasn't another exhibit. It was a notice requesting permission to withdraw from representing Ashford Construction. The courtroom settled again after the recess, but nothing felt the same. Two of Ashford Construction's attorneys had returned with obvious hesitation. One seat at their table remained empty. Gregory looked exhausted. Victoria kept whispering questions that no one answered. Even before the judge entered, I could tell they understood the situation had changed, not because of anything I had said, because events outside the courtroom were moving faster than anyone on their side expected. The judge took his seat. "I've reviewed the arguments presented today, along with the evidence submitted by both parties." The room became completely still. He continued in the same measured tone. "The plaintiff has failed to establish a sufficient factual basis for the damages claimed against Ms. Naomi Carter." Victoria slowly closed her eyes. The judge wasn't finished. "The court also notes significant inconsistencies within the plaintiff's own financial records, several of which remain unexplained despite being specifically identified during today's proceedings." Ashford's lead attorney lowered his head. "Accordingly, the plaintiff's claims are dismissed." No one celebrated. I simply nodded once. The judge looked toward me. "Ms. Carter, this ruling concerns only the civil action before this court. Any other proceedings are outside today's decision." "Understood, Your Honor." He gathered his papers. "If there are no further matters, this hearing is concluded." His gavel came down. For a brief moment, no one moved. Gregory stared blankly at the table. Victoria finally turned toward him. "Tell me this can still be fixed." He didn't answer. He couldn't. Then the courtroom doors opened again. Several people entered wearing dark suits with federal credentials displayed openly. The conversations that had just begun around the room stopped immediately. One of the agents approached the bench first, speaking quietly with the judge. After receiving acknowledgement, he turned toward Gregory. "Mr. Gregory Ashford?" Gregory looked up slowly. The agent spoke in a calm, professional voice. "We have a federal arrest warrant issued by the United States District Court." No one gasped. The silence itself carried enough weight. Another team walked toward Victoria. A third approached two senior executives who had been sitting quietly behind the company's attorneys throughout the hearing. Victoria stood so quickly her chair tipped backward. "There has to be some mistake." The agent remained composed. "You'll have the opportunity to address the charges through the proper legal process." Gregory didn't resist. He looked older than he had that morning. One executive started arguing loudly. "I never approved those transfers." Another agent simply replied, "You can discuss that with your attorney." The courtroom staff stepped aside as the arrests continued without anyone raising their voice. Everything happened with surprising order. Months of investigation had led to this moment. There was no chaos, only procedure. Victoria looked at me while an agent secured her wrists. "You planned this." I met her eyes. "No," I answered quietly. "You planned your own choices. I just refused to protect them." She looked away. As Gregory was escorted toward the exit, he finally glanced at Ethan. Neither of them spoke. There didn't seem to be anything left to say. The attorneys quietly packed their briefcases. Some avoided looking at their former clients altogether. I gathered my own folder and slipped the assignment order back inside. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could finally breathe. I had never wanted revenge. I had wanted the truth to stand on its own. As I walked toward the hallway, I heard footsteps behind me. "Ethan?" He stopped a few feet away. His shoulders were slumped and his eyes looked red from everything he'd witnessed. For a long moment, he couldn't find the words. Then he looked at me with a mixture of regret and disbelief. "I should have believed you." He didn't ask me to stay. He didn't ask for another chance. He simply stood there, waiting to see if I would answer. "I should have believed you." Ethan's voice was barely louder than a whisper. I looked at him for a moment. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He just looked exhausted, like everything he'd believed had collapsed in a single afternoon. "I know," I said quietly. There wasn't anything else to say. Federal agents escorted Victoria, Gregory, and the two executives out of the courtroom while reporters crowded the hallway. Victoria kept insisting there had been a mistake. "My attorneys will fix this." No one answered. Gregory glanced at me once before lowering his head. A few weeks later, I understood why. He agreed to cooperate with investigators. The evidence against Ashford Construction had already been strong, but Gregory filled in the missing pieces. Offshore accounts, shell companies, illegal payments, names investigators had been chasing for years. He wasn't helping because he felt guilty. He was trying to save himself. Still, his testimony expanded the investigation far beyond one company. Victoria chose the opposite approach. She denied everything until the end. The jury didn't believe her. When the sentence was announced, she didn't cry or argue. She simply stared ahead while deputies escorted her away. Ashford Construction didn't survive. Government contracts were canceled. Banks froze their support. Lawsuits followed from every direction. Within months, the company was dissolved. Driving past the empty headquarters later felt strange. For years it had seemed untouchable. Now it was just another abandoned office. Life moved on. The divorce became nothing more than paperwork. Ethan never contacted me again. I heard he moved away to start over, and I hoped he eventually learned that trust isn't something you hand over to the loudest person in the room. One morning, Daniel walked into my office holding a sealed envelope. "They approved it." "The award?" He smiled. "You earned it." A month later, I stood in a government auditorium while our team received official recognition for the investigation. People applauded. Photos were taken. Someone handed me a medal. But all I could think about were the analysts, accountants, and investigators who had spent countless nights building the case. No one solves something like this alone. As the ceremony ended, another official approached me with a thick gray folder. "This came in this morning." I opened it. A classification stamp, a new case number, multi-state procurement network. Inside were company names, transaction records, and financial charts stretching across multiple states. Daniel watched my face. "How bad is it?" I closed the folder. "It makes Ashford look small." He let out a slow breath. "So, we're starting over." I nodded. "We're just getting started." I tucked the file under my arm and walked out of the building. Behind me, people were still celebrating. One company had fallen, but the corruption behind it hadn't disappeared. There was still more work waiting. Sometimes justice doesn't erase the damage that's already been done. What it does is remind us that truth eventually catches up with people who believe they're untouchable. One victory can close a chapter, but it can also reveal a much bigger story still waiting to be told. If Naomi's journey resonated with you, I'd love to hear what moment stood out the most. Share your thoughts in the comments. Pass this story along to someone who enjoys powerful family dramas, and subscribe if you'd like to join me for the next story. Until next time, thank you for listening, and take care.